They called him a fool, because in their minds, wars were won by generals, not by farmers, because they couldn't imagine that something as ridiculous as honey could silence an army. But they were wrong, dead wrong. In 1944, while engineers and officers debated fuel, steel, and strategy, one man in Iowa was building something no one else understood. He wasn't making a weapon. He was erasing one. What he made didn't kill a single soldier, but it made the Wehrmacht deaf. The U.S. Army laughed at his bee-spit until 200 American trucks rolled through German territory in complete silence. No noise, no detection, no losses. And that's the part of World War II no one talks about, because it wasn't loud, it was quiet, too quiet to be remembered. You've heard of radar, you've heard of code breakers, of engines and bombs and glory, but no one ever told you that silence, pure, engineered silence, once changed the outcome of a war. By 1944, sound had become a liability. Every truck, every hinge, every drop of leaking oil screamed location to German patrols. Convoys were ambushed not because they were seen, but because they were heard. And while entire research divisions obsessed over jet engines and rockets, one rejected farmer, John Winslow Carson, was manufacturing silence from the most primitive material on Earth, honey. His discovery wasn't genius. It was necessity sharpened by humiliation. When the Army dismissed his shipments as bee spit, he turned insult into innovation. He mixed raw honey with linseed oil and beeswax and built a resin that killed sound itself. They later gave it a code name, SSC-7 Sweet Silence Compound. In laboratory notes, it was classified as non-lethal acoustic insulation. On the battlefield, soldiers called it ghost syrup. When brushed over axles, hinges, and exhaust seams, it did what steel couldn't. It muted vibration. It absorbed frequency. It smothered the mechanical heartbeat of war. And during the Normandy campaign, while shells shattered the French coast, 200 American trucks coated in Carson's compound rolled through what the Germans called kill zones. But the Wehrmacht heard nothing. Not a squeak, not a breath of diesel, just an army that moved like fog through the dark. That's what Carson built, not a weapon, but an absence. A silence so complete it became an instrument of survival. Most people think honey is just sweetness, a relic of nature, harmless, primitive. But to engineers, it's a biochemical system, a liquid machine forged by evolution. It's dense, hydrophobic, and alive with microstructure. When it bonds with oil and wax, it doesn't just stick, it seals, isolates, insulates. To a scientist, that's chemistry. To the U.S. Army in 1944, that became strategy. The mixture Carson created, SSC-7, operated on three fronts of physics: friction, frequency, and flow. It replaced the metallic scream of gears with a viscous whisper. It turned vibration into heat, and heat into nothing. Field reports showed acoustic detection ranges shrinking by as much as 25%. That number sounds small until you remember that in occupied France, 25% was the distance between ambush and survival. And when the first convoy coated in SSC-7 crossed the roads near Sainte-Mère-Église, German scouts didn't hear trucks. They heard wind. They fired too late. That silence wasn't luck, it was designed. An engineered void made in a barn by a man the system ignored. For decades, history worshipped the noise, the guns, the engines, the bombs. But what if victory was built, not by those who made the loudest impact, but by those who made the world go quiet? For most Americans, the war existed as headlines and ration books. For John Carson, it existed in silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of irrelevance. In 1942, the United States turned itself into a machine. Every river, factory, and farm was absorbed into what the government called total war production. It wasn't an economy anymore, it was an organism. And in that organism, every citizen was expected to serve a function. The strong went to war. The clever designed the weapons. The rest were told to produce. The logic was simple. Output equals worth. You were valuable only if you produced something measurable: tons of steel, gallons of fuel, acres of grain. War stripped away everything sentimental. It became arithmetic. Factories worked 3 shifts a day. Detroit turned from cars to tanks. General Electric built gun turrets instead of washing machines. Even Coca-Cola set up bottling plants near the front lines to boost morale. And in the middle of this mechanical fever, Iowa, the country's quiet heart. To most Americans, it was farmland. To the Army, it was logistics. Every bushel, every drop of oil, every gallon of ethanol mattered. The Midwest wasn't the background of the war, it was the bloodstream. John Carson lived inside that bloodstream, but never felt like part of it. He had inherited 160 acres and 200 beehives from his father. By 1939, that made him modestly successful. By 1942, it made him expendable. When the draft board examined his bad knee and stamped 4F on his file, unfit for duty, it wasn't a reprieve. It was a sentence. He would stay behind while others fought. His younger brother, Mark, enlisted the next month. The family farm turned into a miniature supply chain. Honey, corn, soybeans all redirected to government quotas. He worked 14 hours a day but felt nothing but the weight of absence. Because in a nation that worshipped production, he wasn't a producer of weapons, only sweetness. And sweetness had no place in a world built on efficiency. Yet that was the core belief of the era. Industry is salvation. To build was to matter. To be idle was to decay. This ideology seeped into every headline, every poster, every radio broadcast. Victory through production. Every hand a weapon. It wasn't propaganda, it was religion. Factories were cathedrals. Assembly lines were rituals. Output was faith made tangible. Carson watched that faith reshape his entire town. The blacksmith turned machinist. The grocer started welding. Even the children collected tin for the army. And every time he saw a train of young men heading east, he felt the same sting. They're part of the machine, and I'm not. He tried to contribute more sugar beets, more honey, more bushels, but it never felt enough. No matter how much he produced, his hands still smelled of earth, not metal. And in the industrial gospel of wartime America, that smell meant inferiority. He began to see the war not as a conflict between nations, but as a test of systems, a competition between mechanisms of survival. Germany built engines. America built capacity. Whoever built faster won. It was a cruel kind of logic. Perfection measured in output, humanity reduced to horsepower. But Carson, without realizing it, shared that faith. He believed in efficiency like others believed in God. He just lacked the means to prove it. That belief shaped every decision he made, every jar he sealed, every shipment he signed for. He didn't see bees as insects, he saw them as workers, biological machines that embodied everything America praised. Discipline, precision, productivity. Each hive was an engine. Each drop of honey was labor transformed into function. He began to study them not as a farmer, but as an observer of systems. He noticed their perfect order, no wasted motion, no hierarchy beyond purpose. In a way, his apiary became a mirror of the industrial nation outside his farm. A miniature America, but purer, more honest, uncorrupted by pride. That was his belief system. Nature builds better machines than men. And if men could learn from that, maybe even war could be redefined. But there was a contradiction buried inside that thought. Because if nature's machines were superior, then human machines and the people running them were flawed. That idea wasn't patriotic. It was dangerous. In 1943, when he began supplying honey to the army, he didn't think he was changing anything. He just filled barrels, signed papers, and watched trucks vanish down the road. New credit, new letters, new acknowledgement, just quotas. The system he believed in efficiency gave him no satisfaction. It only measured him, never recognized him. He was a gear that turned but didn't matter. And in that invisible humiliation between faith in the system and the system's indifference, something began to fracture. Because systems don't feel humiliation. People do. And humiliation is where innovation starts. The contradiction arrived quietly, like most revolutions do. It didn't start with anger. It started with mockery. By the spring of 1944, John Carson had become the town's running joke. Bee-man, sweet soldier. Still fighting Hitler with syrup, John? He laughed when they said it, but inside, he was rotting. Every shipment he sent to the army disappeared into silence. No confirmation, no feedback, no proof that it mattered. He filled barrels under government orders, watched trucks take them away, and never knew if any of it reached a soldier or just a warehouse in Kansas. The war had turned every man into a statistic, and John couldn't even find his number. He kept a single letter from his brother folded in his pocket, the paper soft from sweat and time. We're cold, wet, sometimes hungry, but we move. If you send anything, send warmth. That line became an obsession. Send warmth. He repeated it like prayer, like formula, until it became equation. Warmth meant energy. Energy meant combustion. Combustion meant life. But how could something warm come from something so sweet? That question split him in two. The believer in the system and the man who had been forgotten by it. He began experimenting, not out of ambition but spite. He wanted to prove that his bee spit could do something the Army's polished engineers couldn't. That winter, the Iowa cold bit through every wall. The hinges on his barn screamed with rust. The air reeked of diesel from old tractors. He dipped a rag into a mix of leftover honey and linseed oil, rubbed it across the iron hinge, and the scream vanished. Just like that. It wasn't a miracle. It was a principle. Viscosity, vibration, absorption. Nature had already solved what engineers were still diagramming. When he opened the barn door again, he felt the silence. Not peace performance. It was as if the metal itself had stopped resisting. The next morning, an army truck pulled up the gravel road. 2 soldiers. Clipboard. Routine pickup. But the corporal looked exhausted, hollow eyes, black dust on his boots. John asked, "Rough night?" The man nodded. 6 trucks. Gone. Krauts heard us before we even cleared the ridge. Metal squeals, oil stink gave us away. John hesitated, then said what most farmers would never dare say to a soldier. "I can fix that." The corporal frowned. "You what?" "I can make it quiet," he explained, half proud, half desperate about the mixture, the hinge, the silence. The corporal laughed. "You want us to smear bee spit on army trucks?" John didn't smile. "It might save 6 next time." The soldier's laugh died. He stared, then shrugged. "Fine. 1 crate. For testing." It was the smallest act of faith in John's life, and it changed everything. He spent that night awake, stirring honey and wax by lamplight, the smell thick as smoke. Outside, the hives hummed like turbines. Inside, a farmer was turning humiliation into design. Days passed, no news, no message. He went back to the fields, to routine, to the rhythm of a man who didn't matter. Then, one afternoon, a black sedan arrived. 2 men stepped out. No insignia, no small talk. One wore a medic's armband, the other carried a file. "Mr. Carson," the man said, "we ran a test." John's hands froze, and the officer held up a report. 3 trucks, coated the axles, hinges, exhausts. They ran silent. Germans didn't hear a thing. The medic smirked. Smelled like a bakery but ran like ghosts. Then the officer extended a paper military, stamped in red. "Effective immediately. You're authorized to produce 100 gallons per month." Code name, Sweet Silence. John stared. The ink looked unreal. Sweet Silence. A name that sounded like poetry to anyone else, but to him it was revenge. When the car left, he walked to his barn and sat down beside a hive. The bees were restless, their wings like tiny engines in formation. He whispered, "They called me a fool." The swarm answered with a low vibration, the same sound that had once haunted him, now weaponized. He understood something the system had forgotten. Machines make noise when they fight against themselves. Efficiency is silence. From that night, the farm changed. The barn became a production line. Honey flowed into drums. Wax melted in vats. The air grew heavy with the scent of industry disguised as nature. Each barrel that rolled out of his gate carried a secret no one could read, the first acoustic camouflage of modern war. He no longer wanted to fight. He wanted to disappear and take the noise of war with him. The moment the army stamped the code name Sweet Silence, a line had been crossed. It was no longer the idea of a farmer, it was an entry in a system, an invisible part number in the industrial anatomy of war. From that point on, John Carson's farm stopped being a place. It became a node, a biological outpost in the machinery of the Allied supply chain. Every barrel of compound he produced left Iowa the same way: sealed, unmarked, classified. Destination: Fort Riley, Kansas. From there, it was split into coded shipments, ferried by rail through Chicago to the eastern ports. By May 1944, drums marked SSC-7 were stacked beside crates of lubricants, paint, and ammunition on the docks of New York. No one loading them knew what they were. No one was supposed to. In the language of the war bureaucracy, Carson's compound was listed under non-explosive engineering materials, a category that existed precisely to hide things that mattered. The industrial system that absorbed his invention was the same one that had once ignored him. Its beauty and its cruelty lay in that indifference. It didn't care where innovation came from, only that it worked. The moment something proved useful, it was consumed by the machine, depersonalized, standardized, multiplied. Carson's barrels were copied, repackaged, and distributed with mechanical precision. In less than a month, the compound moved through 3 continents without anyone outside a logistics office even knowing who had made it. That was how total war functioned. Individual genius didn't matter, only integration did. The real miracle wasn't discovery. It was absorption. Inside the barn, production changed shape. What began as jars and buckets turned into a small-scale factory. Barrels lined the walls like organs inside a body. Honey, wax, and linseed oil pumped through the room in sequence. Mix, heat, cool, pour. The air thickened with sugar smoke. Flies clung to the windows. The floor became an amber crust that stuck to boots and tools alike. John no longer saw it as mess, he saw it as structure. Every layer, every temperature shift, every ratio of resin and oil was recorded in a notebook blackened with fingerprints. The entries read like the language of engineers. Viscosity, 7.3. Temperature yield, (2.4). Friction test, hinge silence, complete. He was still just a man with bees, but he was thinking like a metallurgist. Outside, the hives pulsed with the same rhythm as his barrels. The sound of bees merged with the low hum of his mixing tools until the two were indistinguishable. Biology and industry had fused. Nature had been drafted. By early June, the army increased his quota, 200 galleons per month. He was instructed to deliver directly to Port of Liverpool, marked Engineering Priority A. No other explanation was given, but Carson knew what that meant. You didn't ship engineering materials to Liverpool in 1944 unless they were going to the invasion. Every man in America was guessing when and where D-Day would happen. John didn't have to guess, his hives were working overtime. The smell of honey and smoke meant something was about to move. He spent the last night before shipment alone in the barn, watching the resin cool in the half-light. He whispered to himself, "This will never make noise again." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, not weather, but practice. The country was alive with the tremor of machines. When the barrels reached England, they entered another system, the labyrinth of Allied logistics that stretched from docks to depots to front lines. The Quartermaster Corps treated them like an experiment. No official record, no public acknowledgement. A few officers in the European theater knew the code name SSC-7 and the phrase, "apply to vehicle joints during night operations." That was it. Field mechanics opened the barrels, expecting lubricant, and found a black, viscous syrup that smelled like burned sugar. They brushed it on axles, doors, and exhaust seams. It clung like tar, hardened like wax, and muffled every creak of metal. At first, soldiers mocked it. They called it ghost grease, sticky death, Iowa molasses. But then came the first mission. A convoy of 6 trucks, coated in the compound, moved through the hedgerows near St. Mère Église. No mechanical clank, no echo of gears. German scouts reported movement too late. The trucks reached their drop zone intact. The after-action note was only one line. New coding effective enemy acoustic detection reduced. That line traveled back through the logistics chain faster than any order. In a war of hierarchy, results spoke louder than rank. Within a week, sweet silence became mandatory for night convoys under the 59th Logistics Division. Mechanics began applying it with brushes, rags, even bare hands. The compound spread like rumor, faster than it could be documented. The chemistry of Carson's mixture was primitive but brilliant. Honey provided density. Beeswax added structure. Linseed oil bonded the two into a semi-elastic resin that absorbed vibration across metal surfaces. When engines ran, micro-vibrations usually traveled through axles and doors as high-frequency noise easily picked up by German acoustic sensors hidden miles away. SSC-7 interrupted that chain. Instead of transmitting sound, it turned vibration into heat and trapped it. The difference was small, almost imperceptible. But in war, imperceptible was invincible. To the Wehrmacht, the world simply went quieter. As June turned to July, more shipments left Iowa. Carson didn't celebrate. He just kept working. His hands were blistered, his clothes permanently stained with resin. Every barrel carried the same unspoken equation. Silence equals distance equals survival. Then, one morning, an envelope arrived. No stamp, no sender. Inside was a single photograph, 6 trucks parked behind hedgerows. One soldier crouched beside a wheel, brush in hand. On the back, written in pencil, "Your stuff saved us." No signature, no address, just evidence. For the first time, he felt the war breathe back. Across the Atlantic, his invention evolved. British engineers refined the mixture with industrial solvents, producing lighter variants for Jeeps and half-tracks. Canadian mechanics discovered that when applied around exhaust vents, SSC-7 reduced infrared emissions, accidental camouflage against thermal sensors. None of these improvements bore his name. In military archives, the original source remained listed as Civilian Supplier, Iowa. Carson's existence was deleted by success, but the silence he built grew louder. The peak came in August 1944, the Falaise Pocket. 50,000 German soldiers trapped between converging Allied forces. Every supply route mattered. Every delay risked collapse. Convoy Echo 9, 212 trucks coated with SSC-7 was ordered to move through enemy-infested roads under cover of fog. No headlights, no radio, engines barely above idle. They crossed within 1 kilometer of a German mortar battery and weren't detected. Only when the last vehicle reached the bridge did the first flare rise. Too late. The convoy delivered over 5,000 gallons of fuel and enough ammunition to sustain the final assault. Historians later called it logistics perfection. No one mentioned the compound that made it possible. Back in Iowa, John's production quietly ended. By September, the Army stopped collecting. New synthetic lubricants were flooding in from DuPont and Standard Oil. The war machine moved on, devouring its own innovations. His barrels sat stacked in the barn like spent shells. The air smelled of wax and dust. The bees went on working, unaware that their honey had become a weapon. When victory came, there was no medal, no record, not even a line in the local paper. Just silence, the kind he had created. But that was the true anatomy of the system he served. Every idea, every man, every triumph was designed to disappear into something larger. A machine that runs best when no one remembers the names inside it. That's how war works. That's how civilization sustains itself, by turning innovation into anonymity. And in that anonymity lies the paradox that built the modern world. The louder our machines became, the more they depended on silence to survive. The war ended for John Carson the same way it had begun, with silence. Not triumph, not applause, just the sound of nothing. By the autumn of 1944, the trucks stopped coming. No messengers, no orders, no papers to sign. The compound barrels stood lined in the barn like forgotten tombstones. At first, he waited. Maybe a delay, a new order, another phase of the war. But deep down, he already knew. The system had shifted again forward, faster, without him. New chemical labs were now producing industrial lubricants by the ton. Engineers at DuPont and Standard Oil had created compounds 100 times cheaper, with standardized formulas, tested, certified, branded. What John had done by instinct, they replicated by design. And like every small miracle in a big system, his invention was consumed, digested, and erased. He didn't protest. He just stood in the doorway of his barn, watching the barrels gather dust, hearing the same wind that once carried bombers now move through empty fields. The hives buzzed on, untouched by the idea of relevance. Their world never changed. They produced, they repaired, they survived without needing to know why. And maybe that was what haunted him most. The bees didn't need recognition to have purpose. Humans did. He still had the photograph, the one sent from France, with the scribbled line, "Your stuff saved us." He kept it in a mason jar on the shelf beside an old radio. Some nights, he would turn on the static, listening for anything that might tell him the war was over. When VE Day finally came, it didn't sound like victory. It sounded like distance. Cities roared. Bands played. But in Iowa, it was quiet. No one came to ask about the barrels. No one came to ask about him. The local paper listed factory workers, mechanics, and soldiers who had served the cause. His name wasn't among them. In the public version of history, war was a sequence of explosions. There was no place for men who engineered the absence of noise. He went back to farming, back to honey, back to the rhythm that had once made him invisible. But something inside him had changed. The man who once believed that efficiency was salvation now saw the cost of it. The system didn't reward perfection, it replaced it. It didn't remember silence, it buried it. That was the hidden flaw in the industrial faith he had served. Every system that worships progress eventually devours the human who made it possible. He thought about his brother Mark, who had returned thinner, quieter, carrying a shadow in his eyes. One night, over coffee, Mark mentioned something almost casually. "I heard they tested your stuff on Navy boats, too." John smirked. "Well, hell, maybe I sank a U-boat." They both laughed, but the laugh had no echo. The next morning, John walked out to the hives. The sun hit the old barn, peeling its paint in slow flakes. Inside, the barrels sat like fossils, the remains of an extinct technology. He touched one of them. The resin inside had hardened solid, ambered into stone. The silence he had built was permanent now, frozen. Years passed. The war faded into textbooks. New wars came, new machines, new systems that ran faster and screamed louder. Carson never patented anything. He never wrote to Washington. He never told anyone what he'd done. In 1953, a government surveyor visited his property for a census. At the end of the form, the man asked, "Did your farm contribute to the war effort?" Carson paused. "In a way," he said. "I kept some folks alive." The inspector smiled, pen hovering. "So, food production?" "No," Carson replied. "I made them harder to hear." The inspector hesitated, then left the box blank. By the 1,960 seconds, the barn began to collapse in on itself. The barrels rusted and split. The notebooks turned to pulp under years of humidity. Only the bees survived unchanged, relentless, eternal. Carson died in 1920. The local obituary was 4 lines long. John W. Carson, lifelong farmer and beekeeper, died Sunday at home, survived by his brother Mark. No mention of Normandy, no mention of trucks, no mention of silence. Decades later, children exploring the ruins of his property found a rusted metal box beneath the gate. Inside, a cracked jar wrapped in wax paper. Inside that a folded note, stiff and yellow with age. It read, "Sweet silence. Remember us." They didn't understand it. They never could. But maybe they didn't have to, because what John Carson built wasn't meant to be remembered, it was meant to disappear. The system that erased him still exists today. Different faces, faster engines, Louder machines, but the same logic. If it works, it belongs to everyone. If it's forgotten, it worked too well. And that's how the war ended for John Carson. Not with sound, not with fire, but with the quiet realization that in a world built on progress, the truest form of victory is to be replaced by what you've made. The silence he engineered outlived him. It still echoes in every machine that hides its noise, every engine that hums instead of screams. Because somewhere in the heart of every system, there's a trace of that forgotten farmer, the man they called a fool, who proved that even in war, silence can speak louder than steel. Silence is not absence. It's the highest form of control. Every machine humanity has ever built, from the first hammer to the hydrogen bomb, began with noise. And every civilization that lasted learned how to hide it. That's what John Carson discovered, whether he knew it or not. His sweet silence wasn't just a wartime trick, it was a mirror of civilization itself, a system that thrives only when its chaos becomes inaudible. Industrial power has always depended on concealment. Factories roar at their birth, then vanish into hums and vibrations, their violence buried under efficiency. Progress doesn't shout, it whispers, it compresses, it absorbs. The more perfect the system, the quieter it becomes. A jet engine at full thrust is a marvel of design, not because it's loud, but because it can contain that noise without tearing itself apart. An economy, a state, a society, they all follow the same physics. They survive by turning friction into rhythm, disorder into flow. Carson's compound was the physical expression of that law. Efficiency equals silence. He reduced chaos to stillness, made vibration into heat, and heat into nothing. His resin was not a lubricant, it was philosophy in chemical form. He proved that control isn't about dominance. It's about reduction, about building systems so seamless that the struggle inside them can no longer be heard. The modern world worships that silence. We call it optimization, automation, progress. But beneath it lies the same paradox Carson faced in his barn. The quieter a system becomes, the less we remember the people who made it. Every algorithm, every factory line, every logistics network that hums beneath our cities is built on invisible genius and buried names. We celebrate outcomes, not origins. Our world runs on the labor of the forgotten. Carson's story isn't an anomaly, it's a prototype. The anonymous creator whose work becomes so integral it disappears into the background. The bee that builds the hive and then vanishes behind it. The moral of his silence is not humility, it's inevitability. Civilization, at its core, is a noise management system. We engineer engines to muffle combustion, cities to swallow traffic, societies to absorb conflict. Every layer of order is a new way to silence something beneath it. That's why peace sounds like nothing, it's just the noise we've learned to bury. But silence also deceives. It hides consequence. It disguises exhaustion as stability, compliance as progress. The same discipline that kept Carson's hives alive is the same that can turn a civilization into an obedient mechanism, flawless, efficient, and utterly blind. When he created his compound, he didn't just make trucks silent. He made an empire quieter, and therefore stronger. His work proved that mastery comes from understanding friction, not erasing it. But the system that used him learned the wrong lesson. Instead of reverence for the small and precise, it built bigger machines to bury the small completely. That's the curse of the industrial age. We don't listen to the silence we create. Carson's silence lives on, not in museums or memorials, but in the engines of ships that cross oceans without a sound, in the whispering turbines that power cities, in the invisible hum of a digital world that processes billions of commands per second in perfect quiet. Every time a modern engine runs smoother, every time a city functions without chaos, we're living inside his philosophy. That perfection is not loud, that control is not power, that the future is built by those who learn to mute the world and let precision speak for them. But there's a cost. Silence doesn't remember, it just performs. And one day, like Carson, every system builder becomes irrelevant, their work too perfect to need them anymore. Still, maybe that's the truest victory. Maybe civilization's highest form of success is to erase the names of those who built it because the system runs too well to ever break again. Carson's barrels are gone. His bees are dust, but his silence remains. It's in the engines that whisper instead of roar, in the assembly lines that move like choreography, in the quiet hum of the power grid that never sleeps. And in that mechanical hush, that invisible, endless rhythm, lies the real voice of the industrial age. Because history remembers the explosions, but the future belongs to the ones who learned how to stop them. The war is over. The machines have changed. The noise has returned. But somewhere buried under the engines, beneath the data centers, inside the walls of cities, the silence still breathes. It's easy to believe that history moves through thunder, the artillery, the speeches, the parades, but history's real voice is quieter. It's the hum between things, the steady, tireless vibration of a system that refuses to stop. John Carson never heard that echo, but he built part of it. His hands, his bees, his barrels of honey all melted into the bloodstream of progress. He died with no proof that what he made had survived. But that's the irony of perfect systems. They keep running long after their creators have gone deaf. Decades after the war, engineers rediscovered the concept of acoustic dampening vibration control, thermal diffusion, resonance suppression. They patented it, scaled it, gave it new names: polymer-based soundproofing, anti-vibration compounds, stealth coatings. Every modern jet, submarine, or server rack uses some descendant of what Carson mixed in a barn with a tin bucket. None of those engineers knew his name. They didn't need to, because the machine doesn't remember its builders. It only remembers their function. That's the logic of civilization. It consumes innovation the way fire consumes oxygen instantly, completely, leaving only the warmth behind. And so, when we walk through our silent airports, when we drive cars that whisper at 100 miles an hour, when we touch glass screens that process our commands without a sound we are hearing him, the ghost hum of the farmer they called a fool, the hum of a world that learned to hide its noise. Silence became the anthem of a century that worshipped speed. We learned to design it, measure it, monetize it. Noise meant inefficiency. Stillness meant control. What began as a trick to move trucks unnoticed became the blueprint for how the modern world hides its own chaos. Carson's silence is no longer in barns or battlefields. It's in the coded architectures of digital empires, in the machines that listen but never speak, in the cities that glow but never sleep. The world he unknowingly shaped no longer fights wars for silence, it lives inside it. We've built an era so optimized that we barely hear the human inside the system anymore. Sometimes, late at night, when the hum of civilization drops low enough, you can still hear what he heard: the faint vibration of bees, the same rhythm of labor, repetition, precision, the sound of a million wings moving toward a single, invisible purpose. That's what progress sounds like, not thunder, not victory, just continuity. A machine that never asks why, only how long. In that sense, John Carson won. His silence outlasted every engine of his time. It became the default state of the modern world, a civilization built not on the noise of ambition, but on the quiet efficiency of function. He built no monuments, no legacy, no record, only resonance. And resonance never dies. It travels through steel, through oil, through data, through every system that refuses to break. If there's a lesson in his silence, it's this: progress doesn't roar. It whispers until no one can hear it anymore. And maybe that's how history truly ends. Not in explosion, not in collapse, but in a single, endless hum. A sound too soft to notice, too constant to remember, too perfect to stop. The echo of the machine. The last sound civilization will ever make.